Bueno, pues continuamos ya con esta última parte.
So this is the last part of this doctoral seminar of the 12th European Award. Angela Merkel, the first European United, securing and strengthening Europe's cohesion. And now we have Gabriel Hernández Rodríguez, the researcher. He will be introduced by Anna MILOŠEVIĆ. And she's an expert in her subject. She's been a member of the jury to the scholarships on many occasions. She's also a member of the Yuste Alumni network. She works at the Leuven in Belgium. She was one of the researchers who got on a scholarship back in the day. So you can see why these scholarships are important. You're here today, but we wish that you will benefit from them so that in the future you can further contribute to this debate on Europe. And you, who knows, may be part of the jury in the future, and you can even be moderating one of the sessions in the future. So Anna contributes with great quality reflections and remarks, as you have seen in her previous remarks. You have the floor.
Thank you, Miguel. It's very good to be back in Yuste. It really feels like coming back home. Well, as Miguel said, I'm always very attentive about everything that is being said. So I would like you to be very attentive about this specific panel, and also to reiterate what Miguel said earlier on the importance of speaking slowly, because we have interpreters, and interpreters are really suffering also from the heat in the cabin. So thank you in advance for doing that. Maybe another housekeeping rule. Is this too loud maybe for you? So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to give, let's say, a brief overview of what is going to be the content of this panel. So how I see the connection between the EU cohesion and the contribution of Gabriel before he delivers his presentation. And then we are going to have Q&A session. How I'm going to do that? Well, Gabriel's paper is actually speaking about EU cohesion, and it also highlights this importance of spatial construction of architecture, which is not very different from what we have heard in the previous presentation by Amos, because Amos as well speaks about Europe as a project. He speaks about urban spaces, about the development, about building. So these are some of the key notions also in the architecture. And if we look at the history of EU metaphors, they are full of architecture metaphors. We speak about social building of Europe, EU identity building, construction of Europe. We talk about architects of European project. We were making jokes about the founding father of this seminar, but they are also seen as architects of the European projects, European founding fathers, and also mothers. So let's not forget about the women who helped construct Europe. When we talk about Europe, we often talk about Europe as a continent. So it's also a contested space, whether the Europe is the European Union or whether the Europe is a continent. We talk about Europe as being a house. We talk about Europe being a symbol. So it becomes very evident that the connection between the architecture and the EU cohesion can be found in these spatial and symbolic arrangements of the EU cohesion that speaks about unity and about negotiations about what is Europe. This can be seen in history of the European Union through this spatial and symbolic building of the EU, whereby we had symbols taken from the architecture that became symbols of Europe. Think about the Berlin Wall. It's a wall. Think about borders. Think about the ways that the EU policy has been built over time. So we have seen increasingly since the 70s, actually, the building, the creation of different kind of EU policies that were dealing with architecture, with heritage. We have seen the European heritage policy, we have seen the cultural policy, and then around the 90s, we have seen that there was this European attempt at preserving historical sites, monuments, tangible and intangible heritage, in which it was very prominent, the architecture of terror, if we think about conserving the concentration camps and sites where many Europeans have fallen victims. So this invites a rearrangement of this spatial and symbolic values as well, in terms of negotiating what Europe is, or maybe what Europe is not. So these can be existing, but also imagined symbolic values. So I have here some money to show to you when the difference between the existing and imagined architectures of Europe. So 20 euros. Which one do you want to start first? More value or less value? Let's go. Now, let's go with less value, because Europe is not all about money. So if you take funny comments in the back. So if you take a look at the paper money and the introduction of euro, you will see a series of bridges. So if you don't remember, this is the bridge. Do you know where this bridge comes from? You are an architect, so you don't get to answer. There are no bridges like this on European currency. They not exist in the nature. So this is also telling that the Europeans, when they made the euro, they could not agree upon what they should put on the banknotes. So this imagined Europe, these imagined architectures like bridges, they were also one of the creative ways of finding that unity and overcoming, bridging that disagreement. So I will stop with metaphors, and I will just say that this is a very interesting discursive space that Gabriel situates between what are existing and what are imagined architectures, and ultimately what he is going to question in this magnificent paper is the transformative value of architecture. So pay attention to what Gabriel is actually going to say. And now I'm just like briefly going to say a couple of words about Gabriel, because it's his moment. Gabriel Hernández is an architect and a researcher. He's a strange animal that has graduated architecture, and he has a master's degree, and he's now undergoing a PhD program in architecture at the Technical University of Madrid. Previously, he has been a very engaged architect that has had several research stays at the Yale University, MIT. He obtained a Fulbright pre-doctoral grant, and his professional career highlights his role as a head of education and research at the Norman Foster Foundation. He was project coordinator. He worked with different architectural studios, and please, a warm welcome for Gabriel in his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the warm welcome. Thank you also everyone in the team in the Fundación Yuste for allowing us to be able to share our research here, and especially for me, I'm very excited to share my research out of the typical architectural academic context. So I'm very excited, especially to hear the feedback from the committee, but also from my peers. Having said that, what I'm going to present here today, it's actually a tiny part of my dissertation, which I was very excited to come up with these connections. The title, as you can see, A Contemporary Perspective from Architecture in the Context of the European Green Deal. Foster Associates' proposal for La Gomera as a symbol of European cohesion and innovation. So actually, everything started when I was reading the rationale and context of the open call. Suddenly, I started to find words that were resonating with the research I was doing, like more focused like in architectural outcomes, let's say. So the Mrs. Merkel text highlighted the idea of a smarter Europe, a more connected Europe, a more social Europe, and a Europe closer to its citizens. So I was thinking, what if we, instead of Europe, what if we have architecture there? So a smarter architecture, more connected architecture, more social architecture, and architecture closer to the citizen. So I was trying to connect, and I was deeply inspired, especially for the second paragraph, where it says an essential component of the EU's political architecture promoting solidarity, sustainability, and European integration. So I said, maybe it's not a call made specifically for architects, but I think that from architecture, we have a lot to say here, that we could actually engage in the conversation of, as Professor MILOŠEVIĆ was saying, the building of Europe. So if we're talking about buildings, why not addressing this from architecture? So this is how I came up with this proposal, which would eventually become a paper. But actually, this proposal, of course, comes from my dissertation. So my dissertation has a bigger framework. It's mapping design systems, archaeology of Fosse Associates practice early years. So in order for you to understand how this became a spin-off of my dissertation, we need to talk about who were Fosse Associates, the very basics. So Fosse Associates was a British architecture studio founded in 1967 in London, in the UK, by Norman Foster and Wendy Foster. During the 70s and 80s, they were very relevant in the architecture fields, and they're one of the studios mostly associated with high tech, or the incorporation of high technology in the architecture field, addressing topics of sustainability and innovation. So this was happening in the 70s, and then in the 80s, they have a big jump into the global practice, which is also very relevant in globalization nowadays, to go back to see how was the first global architecture practice. Of course, this also, nowadays, Fosse Associates operates under a different name, Foster and Partners, under Norman Foster, who you see in one of the pictures, which at the same time operates the Norman Foster Foundation. So that's actually the start, the first seed of my dissertation. And we were actually discussing with Rick of how we are personally connected with the experience we've had. So my experience as head of education and research and building up the archive of the institution, that's when I realized that there were lots of stories that emerged from those archival contents. And I thought that they were interested to do research and to talk about them. Maybe you're possibly more familiar with Foster's later work. So I've brought a couple of images of more recent buildings, as in the Swiss Re Tower in London, Reichstag renovation, or the Bilbao Metro. That's the idea that people normally have of Foster. But we're not going to talk about that kind of Foster. We're going to go back to the 1970s, where there's a very rare project, which in this architecture firm career, which is a project in La Gomera. So the Canary Island of La Gomera, as most of you know already, I'm from the Canary Islands. So I was very excited to see that within this massive studio, there was kind of a forgotten project in the 70s, which was very intriguing because there was very few information about this project. So that's when I started diving deep. And actually, to talk very briefly about the framework and methodology of this research, so there's a combination of archival research. So primary sources are archives, but then I utilize the framework of design ethnography, spatial history. That's where I've been mostly doing research at the Norman Foster Foundation Archive, also at Yale University Archives, where they have a big archive of sustainability, and the Royal Institute of British Architects in the UK. So it's a transnational kind of research. And then, of course, I think in the previous presenter, we're talking about interviews. So I've done already around approximately 30 interviews with the agents, and to get this one-to-one feedback of what was really going on for this project. So if we go back to the proposal, there's 4 keywords embedded in the title, which I think are relevant to unpack before I get to discuss the proposal. These 4 keywords are the ones that you'll see underlined. So architecture, which talks about disciplinary boundaries. European Green Deal, so this institutional framework that Europe is trying to go towards to. La Gomera as a context and site. And then the idea of cohesion and innovation in the design field. So what's the agency from architecture between these topics? So if we talk about architecture, nowadays, it's impossible not to mention the connection that we can have from the architecture field with the SDGs. So amongst the 17 SDGs, architecture and the built environment could be directly connected to, well, basically nearly all of them, but then especially the ones that I've underlined, which will be the good health and well-being. No, it's the spaces we inhabited. The affordable and clean energy. So how well or not well prepared are buildings and how energy efficient are they? Industry, innovation, and infrastructure. So the way we're building the architecture. How can we enhance through architecture or the design of architecture sustainable cities and communities? Climate action. So it's the resources that we extract in order to build our built environment. But then especially, and I was very excited because I think or at least for me, when I read the context and rationale for the call, it's about the partnership for the goals. So what if we partner amongst different disciplines to discuss how are we building the environment and what can we learn from that? As you may not know, but architecture and the building of architecture and the extraction of the resources in order to build our environments, it's directly or indirectly, they're responsible for approximately 42% of the CO2 emissions, which is a lot. So I think that instead of feeling guilty, there's lots of possibilities so what can we do in order to reduce as much this very big percentage? So you see on the screen, I've brought some data from 2022, and it's 15.3 gigatons of CO2. And that's a lot. So let's try to think which are the other ways. And I really believe that tackling the SDGs, we can actually come together with solutions that can decrease. And that's basically the project that I'm going to be describing. It's actually, I think, a very good example of how the interaction of all of this together can enable the reduction. Then we have the institutional framework. So the European Green Deal, which was launched in 2019. As you probably know, it's this proposal from the Commission that for Europe to become one of the first climate neutral continent. So let's try to reduce nearly not net zero emissions. And there's a lot of funding related to this, or at least it was before the wars. So it's approximately 1.8 trillion invested directly in order to have this green transition. Within the framework, so there's lots of initiatives in order to address this very important goals. One of them, it's the new European Bauhaus. So there's lots of concepts. So there's climate, energy, agriculture, transport, but the only proper institution created to address this is an European Bauhaus, which, as you may know, it's picking up the name of a German institution which was very innovative 100 years ago and trying to build on that ethos nowadays in order to promote sustainability, aesthetics, and inclusion. So I was wondering, and this is practically what I want to share with you today, how future thinking are these concepts in order for us to address these challenges of building a more sustainable architecture. Then we need to talk about the context. And here, I think with a radically opposite point of view than my previous colleague, Amos, who was talking about cities, now we're going to go to rural places. So we're going out of the urban field, and we're going to go to the outermost regions, which, well, in Spanish, it's región ultraperiférica, which may be more familiar in Spanish, but the outermost regions, so these regions really far from the European continent, that have received lots of funding in order to try to keep up with the developments taking place in the continent. So on the map, you'll see on the screen, the outermost regions are the ones in blue. And one of those, it's Canary Islands. So if probably most of you have visited or at least know where they are, but I think it's very relevant to point out that it's only 125 kilometers away from the African coast. So we're kind of in a different continent, but with a different political framework. And not only we're going to our outermost region, we're gonna go to the second smallest island of this outermost region, which is the island of La Gomera, where the project I'm going to discuss was located. So if the Canary Islands nowadays have approximately 2.24 million, La Gomera, it's only 21K. So it's very small compared. It's also the second smallest. As you can maybe notice in the picture, it's full of mountains. So it's also a difficult place in order to apply these like continental European frameworks for the island to thrive. And why are we going to La Gomera? We're going to La Gomera because 50 years ago, there was an interesting coalition, which for me talks about this cohesion and innovation of different European agencies. So from one side, from Norway, there's a shipping tycoon that owns big portions of the island. On the other side, there's some master plan proposals from Constantino Doxiadis. It's one of the big names in urban planning in the 50s, 60s, 70s in Europe. So there's this agency through urban planning that comes from Greece. And then we have, as I mentioned before, Fossa Associates, so a British architecture firm. So for me, as a Canary Island local, I was kind of intrigued, like, it sounds like a joke, no? Like a Norwegian, a Greek, and British in La Gomera, no? Trying to do something which eventually became super innovative for the time. So I was intrigued, like, what was going on here? And what was actually going on is that each, let's say, European agent was bringing different kinds of frameworks that at some point kind of interacted in order to create this proposal. So from Norway, Fred Olsen came with his ideas of ecology, sustainability, social and corporate responsibilities, and integral developments. From Greece, this urban planning expertise, the idea of island clusters. Of course, it's Greece. They have lots of islands. But, sorry. This idea of network development and systems design. And then from the UK, these ideas of high tech, so technology applied to architecture. How can we have an integrated framework of analysis and research? And then economic circularity. So all of these concepts will be building up in order to create what is considered Europe's first sustainable and integral design master plan in the Canary Islands in 1974, 1975. So for me, this is kind of extreme. Like, how did this happen? And that's when I started to start diving, like enter into the rabbit hole of this project, because there's lots of agency that I think it's interesting to compare the framework that allowed this proposal to be outlined with today's framework that we mentioned of the European Bauhaus within the format of the New Green Deal. Of course, there's also a very big difference also with Amos's presentation, and I really like that we've been paired one after the other, because we're going to a very rural area in an outermost region. But then also this proposal was so radical that was never built, so this is just a project. That's why most of the contents you'll see is basically drawings, because this never got to be built. Was it too radical? Perhaps. But then also I think an interesting difference is that it's basically private investment. So I think I would also put into question, what is the role of the private investment versus the public? But yeah. So basically the research question after this very long introduction. So why is analyzing this project relevant? Like why? Why am I inviting you to, let's do a time travel to the 1970s to understand what was going on, to see what can we learn? Of course, we're talking and discussing about a sustainability milestone. So it's this very, very important project that outlined kind of eco-experimental development proposal, but also because it aligns perfectly with the new challenges we're facing. So we have European Green Deal, we have a new institution, well, new, it's from 2021, the new European Bauhaus. From the architecture and design scene, we're kind of expecting what is this institution really gonna do? And then we know that we need to tackle and address all of these SDGs. But then why is analyzing this project relevant today? Well, today, specifically in the islands, as some of you might know, since last year, since 2024, there's lots of protests going on questioning the tourism model. It's been associated with unsustainable development. There's this social and economic distress. There's a lack of access to housing. There's lots of issues which, interestingly, this project from 50 years ago was already addressing. So why not going back to that sustainability milestone and learning? Because maybe there's some aspects that we could still apply today. So the goals and objectives, before I dive into the details of this project and why I think this project is important to discuss, it's basically 4. So how can collaboration amongst different agents provide the necessary innovation to address the European Green Deal? How can we analyze this anticipation of a proposal which predates in 50 years sustainable development and the new European Bauhaus goals? How can we connect in the wake of these problematics in the islands? How can we learn from this proposal in order to address these contemporary issues through the coalition of different agencies? And then what can we learn from an outermost region to apply to maybe other outermost regions, and also maybe back to continental Europe, sharing the same social problems which are already happening in different, I think, regions already in Spain, and I'm sure that in the Mediterranean area it's happening similarly. So in order to unpack the project and why is it so innovative, we're gonna discuss firstly how did the commission of these proposals emerged. Then we're gonna dive into the proposals from the Greek and the British, and then we're gonna discuss the conclusions. So what was Fred Olsen doing in La Gomera? That will be a first question, this Norwegian tycoon. Well, actually, La Gomera was one of the biggest banana producers, and this Norwegian company was shipping the bananas produced in La Gomera and in other Canary Islands back to London, to the Canary Wharf. That's actually the name. So we have a Norwegian tycoon with with economic interests in the area. And the area where most of the plantations were located was in the south of the island. So I bet none of you have visited La Gomera, or maybe very few of you have visited La Gomera. But if you visit La Gomera, and this is about the geography of the island, there's a huge difference between the north, which it's wet and humid, which it's the trade winds, los vientos alisios, which bring this humidity, and there's a rainforest in the north. But then the south is very, very dry. And the south, as you see some arrows there, brings the calima, or the sirocco, which make the temperature very, very high, and it's even more difficult to grow there. So there's a fragmented ecosystem here, north and south. And basically, in the 1970s, the ecosystems were getting very close to collapse. So environmental collapse, economic collapse, social collapse. So there's a region of the south part of La Gomera, which is Alajero. Alajero is a municipality, and it was basically owned by Fred Olsen. So we're in 1974, we're still in dictatorship Spain. And most of that region had a big dependency on agriculture and the primary sector. So it's agriculture, basically the only economy in the southern part of the island. And there was a lack of infrastructure, energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, all kinds of lack of infrastructure, which in the 1970s with the droughts, so I think it was for 3 years, it received absolutely no rain. It made the collapse of agriculture, which of course creates the depopulation. So there was a huge migration of the population to Venezuela and Tenerife, the biggest island nearby. And actually the population of the island decreased in between 1960 and 1970 in a 25%. And even nowadays, it hasn't even recovered the same population standard. So we're talking about a huge social change, well, economic, social, environmental. So this is the context where suddenly the local government of the island decides to bring Konstantinos Doxiadis, this Greek urban planner, to see which kind of development can they execute in order to avoid a total collapse of the island. So Constantino Doxiadis in the urban field, it's one of the big names. He's very famous for the urban planning for the Rio de Janeiro and the new capital city of Pakistan, Islamabad. So with this big expertise, curiously, of urban places, this is when he was invited to come to the tiny island of La Gomera to develop a master plan. So these are some of the highlights of the master plan. The master plan was based on his ideas of echystics, which is like the science of human settlements. And through the echystics, he decided that the island should develop in 4 different clusters. You could see on the map, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Each cluster was to have a specific focus. So one cluster was for industry, another one, the southern one, was for tourism, another one for tourism and agriculture, and the north with more water, only for agriculture. Together, they were intending to have a big ring road to connect the island. So it's about infrastructure, master plan, and macro scalar components. So these topics are already there on the table in La Gomera. And after this plan was not taken into consideration because of its huge cost, this is when the private investment comes in. And this is when Fred Olsen, shipping tycoon with interests in the area, decides to bring these British architects to see if, based on Doxiadis' plan, there could be some innovation to in order make something good, not only for his economic interest, but also for the interest of the island. And I think this is when things get interesting, because there's this relation between the client and the architect. They had already collaborated before, so they know very well which were the components that each of them worked. So just to be sure, Fred Olsen, he wanted to be sure that there was ecology and sustainability addressed, there was social responsibility, integral developments, whereas the British architects brought high technology and an integrated framework and research analysis. So the master plan, and this is like the proposal that Fred Olsen commissions these British architects. So let's see if there's a master plan that suits the development of tourism and agriculture, if we could eventually incorporate a golf camp and an airport. So there was an infrastructural part, but then especially the basis was to combine tourism exploitation with agriculture and local needs. So it's a kind of radical starting point for a private investment in such a remote location. And interestingly, when the architects were on their way from the UK to La Gomera to see like, but how's La Gomera like? They stop in Tenerife, so the biggest island nearby, because as you may see on the diagram, La Gomera was the only island without an airport. So a very, very low connectivity at that time. And when they pass through Tenerife, that's where they see how tourism was already being developing, and how tourism was kind of destroying all of the coastal areas of Tenerife, as it happens today. So for them, that model of tourism was the antithesis of what they wanted to realize in La Gomera. And actually, within the drawings, I found some of the drawings where they have like scribbles drawings of Tenerife with like, what do we want to avoid Tenerife? So with what we want to avoid is when they arrive to La Gomera and they start not only to go to Alajero, to the southern part, but they understand that in order to understand the island, they need to understand the island as a system. So they need to go all around the island, understand how the island works. And interestingly, and I think this is one of my key points, is that there's collaboration of different disciplines in order to develop this master plan. So there's, of course, architects, but there's photographers, historians, and ecologists. So the first ecologist in the UK, Kenneth Mellanby, was invited to join the team. So already they had a multidisciplinary framework in order to address the problematics. So mixing architecture with history, with the college, and with the local knowledge, as they integrated local architects in the team, that's when they started to think, this is, well, one of the most, I think, relevant pictures that I found in the archive, which for me, it's like this helicopter on a beach, like kind of in a lost paradise. So they are arriving to the island, they are arriving to a forgotten place, and they're trying to see, with the agency of the place and the agency they were bringing, how can all of this come together? So this is when they decide, a scheme, that there's going to be two important parts, which are the parts which are shaded in gray. There's going to be a part of analysis and research, and there's going to be a part of proposals. The analysis and research, it's not the typical architectural research that, especially in the 70s, took place. So part of the analysis and research was the transportation time to get to La Gomera. So how are the different combinations of different transportation once you land in Tenerife? How long did you take to La Gomera? So they were not only designing La Gomera from within La Gomera, but they were designing La Gomera from within the system that allows you to get to La Gomera. So for me, this is quite radical, especially in the architectural and urban scene. Then they questioned the mobility pattern outlined by Doxiadis. Doxiadis proposed a ring road on the coast. They thought that the ring road would destroy the coast, so why not having an inner ring road that would kind of save the coast from the development? But then why not also making transportation as like novel kinds of transportation as a way to incorporate like other activities within the master plan? So why not bring in lifts that the architects had seen in Switzerland? Like we see a drawing of like ski lifts. Why not bring in ski lifts? Of course, helicopters and then hovercrafts. So why not also innovating in the transportation in the way that you get to the island and that you move within the island? If we want to develop the island, and that was the mindset of the architects, we should also be very careful because, as I said previously, there was no infrastructure-based, reliable infrastructure for water and energy. So they did an analysis of what was the water and energy infrastructure like, and which were the possibilities in order to arrive to a self-sufficiency. So they wanted to arrive to this not needing the infrastructure because they knew that probably there was not going to be public infrastructure in order to support any kind of development. And then they realized that their project was not only developing Fred Olsen's property in the south of the island. The project, it was a renovation of the island's ecosystems. And within the renovation of the whole island's ecosystems, then it's when they can redevelop that southern part of the island. So it's thinking in a macro scale in order to get later to the micro, to the micro. And for me, there's a very important diagram that kind of resumes the analysis and research, which is this kind of comic that the architects presented to the local communities. We were talking before about the participation of local communities. Here, the project was already designed with the local communities and with this dialogue. And they said like, okay, we think that there's three aspects. We have the tourism, and our boss, Fred Olsen, wants a golf camp, okay? But then there's a research component because we're doing research in how can we make self-sufficiency, how can we build differently, how can we build with local materials. And actually, one of the proposals within the master plan was to create a UN experimental station for sustainable building located in La Gomera. So also bringing the agency and thinking that the agency developed in La Gomera could also be exported out of the island. And then I think one of the things that interests me the most is the last component, which is like touches architecture directly, which is that building had always, like building had to go hand in hand with planting. So if you build something, you had to plant something or to restore the ecosystem. So that was intended to be the basis of the master plan, which I think is very radical. We're talking about the 1970s, and I think it's kind of an extreme example of this. So the proposals not only once that they understood that there was this like 3 levels of activities happening at the same time, the proposals outlined the island not as clusters, as Doxiadis had suggested with these 4 clusters, but what the Fossa Associates propose is that there's zones of development. So there's 5 rings of developments, and there's 1 zone of controlled development, and that's the only zone where you could have touristic development. So the other 4 zones were safe from tourism. So like putting a limit in order to control the expansion of this industry, which if we think of it today, it would have been very useful in the case of the Canary Islands. So not only they're addressing how new buildings had to be built, but they also addressed how the existing buildings had to be renovated. So how to incorporate all of this technology of self-sufficiency, how all of this could be incorporated within the existing building. So they were thinking of water desalination, solar collectors, wind energy. And remember, this is 50 years ago. So in early 1970s, solar collectors were not anywhere, basically. So they're very radical in the way of, let's bring this technology and make it happen in this very outermost region. Then they outline, and this is interesting, especially for the people coming from the law sector, that they were trying through design to incorporate a system that the local communities would always be consulted with any design phase. So any phasing of the design had to count with the approval of the local community in order to arrive to get an integration. So development could never continue without the local communities being embedded. And I think also a radical aspect is the accommodation types that the architects outlined, which the accommodation types were according to the time visitors or tourists will spend in the island. So you could be a day visitor, you could be a tourist like for a weekly staying, you'll be allotted a tiny unit. If you were a monthly staying, you'll have a bigger unit. And then if you were a monthly visitor, you would get a better kind of unit, more integrated with the local community. And then if you were a permanent visitor, you'll be totally integrated physically within the community. So I think this is also very radical. And this is one of the aspects that, as an architect and designer, I think that what if we try to incorporate this today? No? What would happen? Because as Fred Olsen had asked, the agriculture and the tourism had to be developed together. So we have this very interesting diagram of how the different housing clusters were placed within the banana plantations. So not only for the activities to happen physically in the same space, but also to create this kind of empathy. So visitors will be located inside the banana plantations, and they would see how was the banana industry. And around the banana industry, they would see the visitors, and maybe there's some interactions, maybe not. But at least giving, like, to allow a physical space for this kind of interaction or integration, which I also think it's radical. They even draw, and I think you could try to see like the hands, no? There's a green hand of a banana plantation giving like the hand of the local community. So kind of bringing things together, which I also find very radical, even too radical for today. And then I think another radical aspect, and this is the last radical aspect I'll be discussing, it's how the housing was going to build. So there's this integration of different technologies. So we had this Norwegian client with the Greek urban setting, with the British technology. So of course they thought, okay, we need some technology to be shipped into the island. So there's an interesting mixture of high technology and vernacular. So you might see in the diagrams, there's like a capsule containing kitchen units and toilet units that was to be shipped by helicopter, placed on the site, and then around that, it will be the vernacular architecture of the island in order to include the workforce from the island. So mud, brick, and wood that would kind of cover and would make a bigger I don't know if, but you see the capsules that will be like delivered by helicopter, they will be placed amongst the banana plantations, and then you will have the local workforce doing the other, like incorporating the vernacular elements to this very high technology. So it's kind of extreme. Maybe it's not cost efficient, but at least they were trying to bring this high technology and the local. And of course, this project that includes all of these aspects that would be interesting to incorporate today. And these are most of the aspects that the European Bauhaus are trying to incorporate within their European Green Deal framework. And for me, like going back, like to use history and to use like case studies that were successful, at least in making us dream how a better future could be, I think it's very important to bring it today and to learn what can we bring and incorporate in the way we think about the built environment and architecture today. So this kind of cross-European agency from Norway, Greece, UK in La Gomera allows us to explore, and this is like the last part of the presentation with the conclusions, like how collaboration can enhance innovation and can go towards the European Green Deal 50 years before the European Green Deal. So of course, and this is one of the big words of the European Commission now, it's better together. Then how bringing this case study that analyzed this anticipation of different kinds of technology and sustainable development, how the integration of the different agency was already outlining most of the European Bauhaus and the SDGs. And even, and this is like one of my big questions that I've been thinking about these last weeks before coming here, is that this project, it's even more radical than the actual framework we have of the European Bauhaus. So it's also helping us bringing this case study from 50 years ago to see how radical are the new frameworks which are being created to address sustainability. So my question would be, is it radical enough? Like, should we need something even more extreme to make us dream today, 2025, no? And then how this balance of local communities and development could be readdressed. How can we bring these ideas back? Because we have huge problems now in the islands. It's huge. And I'm trying to be optimistic of how can architecture and design help in this equation, but it's a bigger problem that I think that we could all address together within different fields. So how can we learn back to this kind of alternative tourism models, which could also be applicable to other regions? Because here we are. This kind of innovation that kind of miraculously occurred in a very outermost region, in a small island, in an outermost region in 1974-75, there's like the traceability and application in other contexts. I think it's true. We could actually learn and try to see how can we apply it, especially to the Macaronesian area, which is the other Atlantic archipelagos, but also in Southern Europe, where these tensions with tourism are getting more and more intense. So agency for the margins. So yeah, that's all I wanted to share. Thank you for your attention.
Is it working? Yes, it's working. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for this presentation. I hope you didn't have trouble reading all the slides because it was very detailed and I imagine it wasn't very easy. But if you're interested, I think Gabriel can gladly send you a PDF of presentation. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we found a solution. Okay. I changed my mind. I think we're going to have just a discussion than rather giving you feedback on this specific presentation because it's very rich in content. I'm not an architect, but I am somebody who has dealt with the question of the importance of architecture, of symbolic and spatial values. We chatted briefly just before this panel, and I was explaining to you how important in my research was this symbolic value of building Europe, constructing Europe, through monuments, squares, even the name of the European prize, the closeness of places of memory that we have here, they all speak in favor of this importance of constructing Europe and constructing maybe even European identity. But I wanted to reflect a bit on some of the key notions that you mentioned in your paper. Some of these relate, going back to what I said earlier, about this imagined and existing Europe. So you actually said since the very beginning that this project never realized. Can you maybe say something more about that? Because I think that needs a bit more clarification in terms of your presentation. We start from that.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So yeah, and I think that, and this is like a very personal view based on the archives I've been researching, that the project was too radical. And even if they were drawing comics for local communities and they were really engaged in the way they communicated their ideas were not understood. It's 1974-75 in Franco, Spain. They didn't know what was going on, basically. And with the people I've been interviewing, so I got to interview the local architect, which was part of the team. I've interviewed Foster many times and other agents that were part of the team. The British felt that no one was really understanding what they were doing, and the locals didn't understand what was going on because they were expecting the architect to build a hotel, a resort, and a golf camp. And suddenly they engage in the ecosystem analysis of the whole island, and suddenly they realize that it's not a project of a site and a hotel. It's a project of an island, which was basically out of the commission. And I'm going back to to try to answer your question. I think it was just too radical. And building up on this question, I think it could even be too radical today. And this is something that kind of haunts me. Like, is it that radical today if we get the same project and we try to make it happen?
Well, going on that, so you also in the presentation, you show like the hands intertwining and showing how central was in the project itself and for the makers of the project, this kind of local ownership. But if you say that it was too radical for the local community, that means that like the community rejected this externally imposed notion of what the island should look like in the future. And this leads me also to the question to reflect maybe on the role of models, imposed models in architecture, in European Union, in different kind of presentations that we had, that when we compare different cases and we somehow fail to appreciate maybe local specificities, cultural differences, cultural appropriation. Somebody also spoke about that earlier. So there are these important differences that are crucial in understanding whether the model will be replicated, will be used, will be accepted, or will be rejected. So to connect this maybe to your overall contribution. So in relation to the EU Green Deal and the Bauhaus, how do you see replicability of these kind of models, especially if we do not know whether they really function?
Thank you for that question. So to answer your first question, I think that the local community was not prepared was not even or educated to understand their role within the process. So no one had never asked them anything about development. And suddenly there's this British architects in a helicopter, like making weird questions to them. They didn't understand the process. Hopefully today things will be different. Hopefully there's a bigger agency from local communities, and we see the protests now. So I think there is an agency and there's this willingness to take a substantial part in the conversations of which kind of development should occur in the islands. And then going back to the replicability of the models, I think that we need to try them to see if they work. Because I think that, and especially my peers that, well, maybe not here, but like people who are in a lab testing, I don't know, chemicals or whatever, you need to test to see if it works or not. So I think that hopefully somewhere, anywhere soon in Europe, there will be these kind of experiments taking place so that we could replicate them in communities that really need them or need to rethink their model of development.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. That basically goes back to what we were discussing also earlier in different kind of presentations today, that how we plan for change, how we plan about what we want to achieve with something, whether it's a project, whether we want to discuss the impact or discuss process, if something's working, not working. It basically has to come from an idea that is based on the needs of the local population, so that supports that kind of ownership fostering that you're talking about. And my last reflection about this is just a bit of a philosophical question, because I woke up like that. It's about the question of values. So you mentioned the new Bauhaus that is also based on a model. It's based on what was perceived as avant-garde, innovative kind of approach to not only the architecture and design, but to the basically rethinking the present and rethinking the future. So in terms of that, European Union, as I said in the very beginning, is often seen as a constructed space of symbols and of different kind of values. And if we look at your specific case, we had we could understand that there was this person, this very rich person from Norway, who was exploiting also the Canary Islands and had his business there, that he brought up his own model, which is ecological ideas about the sustainability, ecological resilience of communities for the future that were avant-garde. So if these ideas are now advocated on the EU level through the EU Green Deal, isn't this kind of a shift towards something that maybe we can call green EU values? And would that EU green values be some kind of a path to follow in the future that is based on self-sufficiency, use of local materials, low impact on the environment, and this kind of like a harmony, whether the economy and tourism and local populations and their needs are kind of like brought into some harmonic balance? Is that too complicated of a question? No. Break it down.
Thank you. I also feel very philosophical today, so good. Yeah, so to talk about sustainability, it's already a philosophical concept. No? Like, what is sustainability? You could ask each of us in the room, we'll come up with a very different idea probably. But then for me, it's a very exciting moment now, because finally there's a framework that addresses sustainability, and there's an institution at the European level that addresses architecture and design as a channel of innovation. So I think earlier today, and I think what we'll see mostly with my peers, is that there's innovation through policy or innovation through law, but the European Bauhaus is trying to make innovation through designing the environment. So we're kind of expecting to see what's the next step in all of this.
The micro?
Hola? Ah, okay. So, yeah. So it's a very early stage, but finally we have a framework that it's there, outlined by Europe. It's still very diffuse. It's not, and the new European Bauhaus is still trying to find its own identity. So I'm extremely curious to see which are the next steps, because I think we're still in time to incorporate even more radical ideas, because I think that, and I think it's a discussion I was having earlier with someone, that in the very beginning, it's when you need to dream the most far, and then maybe you will get halfway. But the dream which we have now as the European Bauhaus, it's still tiny. So I would love to see it like way more radical in order for us to go further.
Yeah, I agree about reimagining Europe, that it's not only an ecological matter, but it's also exploiting this moment, because we have to ride on that wave that now it's, trending, this ephemeral architecture and vernacular interventions and vernacular turn. So let's take some questions from the audience and pick up, on some threads.
One, testing, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Jürgen.
Okay, thanks, Gabriel, for this one. In 1968, the Club of Rome published its famous report, Limits of Growth. Did you find any references of Foster to this report? Because, Limits of Growth, it was heavily discussed in these days, and it can be considered as the initial point of the Green Movement, which is or has become a major political power since. I think this connection should definitely be made, because the timeliness is so obvious. Olsen must have read this report, and Foster maybe as well. I'm sure he did, because that's they really tried to take up the arguments given in this report and try to build a new utopia as an answer to this, So I think the interconnection should be a topic dealt by you in your research. And then secondly, I'd like to know a bit more about this European Bauhaus scheme. We shortly talked in the bus about it. Bauhaus, Mies van der Rohe and others, shortly after First World War, there was a radical, indeed, yes. It was a philosophical model, actually, applied on architecture. Where are the links between the original Bauhaus Dessau, and the European Bauhaus? Is it just the name, or what else? Thanks.
Should I answer? Yeah.
Please.
Okay. Thank you for your comments. So I'm not 100% sure if Foster or anyone in the team had read that report. What I'm totally sure is that they were very exposed to the innovation or environmental innovation going on in California of the 60s, early 70s. So they were very familiar. They were actually collaborating with Buckminster Fuller. So Whole Earth Catalog, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is considered one of the first texts of environmentalism. They were very familiar, which is interesting because they were, well, as the UK has always been very conscious of what's going on in the US, in the 60s and 70s, those were kind of the values that they were trying to implement. And I think it's interesting, no? From California to the UK to La Gomera. For me, it seems very radical. And then secondly, about why the naming of the new European Bauhaus, I think you should talk to von der Leyen about the naming, because it was also very surprising for all of us, like the Bauhaus again? But trying to answer your question, I think that they're trying to pick up the innovation that happened back in Dessau in 1990, or in Weimar, and then in Dessau, 1919 until 1931. And they're trying to replicate kind of this model, but it's still, or at least for me, not very convincing how European the naming of Bauhaus is. Maybe we need to invent a new name for it. And I think we're all still very skeptical of, okay, but what it's really the new European Bauhaus? So I've been checking the website this last week a lot, and I'm still not even ready to answer what is really the institution. Hopefully soon we would see what's the next step. Thank you.
Bien, Armando Santana de la Universidad de Jaén.
My name is Armando Santana from the University of Jaén. Thank you, Gabriel, for your presentation. You see how this was designed by an architect because of the layout and the design. I want to give you my legal point of view when you were talking about the framework and the concepts of the Green Deal and the Bauhaus notions. I think it would be interesting to talk about the architectural law in Spain in 2022. Spain was the third country, together with France and Lithuania, to pass a comprehensive law on architecture. I've had the occasion to work on it, and it covers some of the notions and concepts you've covered in your presentation, so maybe you want to have a look at it, because it is in accordance with the framework you've presented. But I loved it. Thank you. Yeah, I know the law on the quality of architecture. It's like a development of what we understand as the new European Bauhaus. So it's funny to see how an institution with shorter, smaller geographical scope kind of relates with it. And at the European level, we can go one step beyond, but we have to wait and see this paradigm shift with the European.
Hi, Gabriel. My name is Rick Keegan from Universidad de Oviedo. I have a curious question. Is there any type of natural hazard-related disaster in La Gomera? And does the architecture there put into the considerations of this natural disaster for their urban planning? Well, you can see you're talking about Green Deal sustainabilities, and the intensity of the climate-related disaster has been increasing in intensity as well as frequency. So in your practice, do you also put this into your consideration when you're designing in architecture? Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, for your question. Yeah, if there's a natural hazard that it's striking hard the islands and many other regions in the same latitude, it's desertification. So there's less and less water, which is changing everything. So like ecosystems, which already in the 1970s, they started to see how the future could be. So how is the future without water? And that's when suddenly there was like an extreme design answer to that like disastrous situation, which unfortunately is a situation it seems we're gonna be facing now, looking towards the future. So I think that, and also connected to the Ley de la Calidad de la Arquitectura, like the more we integrate these situations of disasters and how design or architecture can mediate the causes or the effects of the disasters, I think the better. So yeah, thank you for your question. Do you want to?
No. If you want to continue. Sorry, hello, Gabriel.
Hola.
I feel so stupid speaking in English now, so I think I will do it in Spanish. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you for your presentation. It was like a fantasy journey. For me, it was like watching a documentary film. So thank you. I was kind of visualizing completely in my head. And I think it would be great material for a documentary film. But I couldn't stop thinking about something else. My background is on fine arts. And I was thinking about the importance of the artist and the architect for us to be able to dream. And I think funding today is too bureaucratized, too based on proposals where you have to think about the outcomes since day one. And the project you have presented was very radical, and they dared to dream without any constraints. They could even dream about it without making it real. And well, because in my experience, everything is so strict. You have to produce outcomes. So for me, the most radical aspect of that aspect is that they didn't expect any results. You talked about all the important aspects, private funding, another social or temporary framework. This is a very special case. And if we are to find similar proposals, we need to give the creators the opportunity to just dream. We need to take it into account, because I think these kind of projects, a project like that could not even be born, could not even be dreamt of now. What do you think? I think we are in time. We are in time. The new institutions, the new frameworks that want to regulate the implementation of sustainability in constructions need to take that into account. These projects allow us to build a different future, a different relation with the environment. And so that possibility needs to be reflected by the new framework. You want to reply? Any more questions? We still have a few minutes, Amos. My name is Amos from the Complutense University in Madrid. Thank you, Gabriel. It was fascinating. I wanted to talk about citizen participation, but you already talked about it. It was fascinating to hear that they did that in the 70s. But the most fascinating part is that this innovative and groundbreaking project took place in 1974. You were talking about the archives. Have you ever discovered what was in the minds of these creators? Were they totally unaware of the political context in Spain? Did they really think they could manage to get it done if they didn't make too much noise? What was the interaction between them and Spain? Yeah, a very interesting question, because those were Brits, and it was interesting to see how they perceived the Canary Islands and La Gomera Island. In the correspondence I found in the archives, I found sketches and pictures about the things they found interesting about the project. They have pictures, they have photographs. For example, some of the photographs are people coming out of the church and women wearing scarves. It was striking to them. So it was like going back to the past, a journey to the past when they went to La Gomera. And they were not really aware of the political context because of the language and because of their ignorance. So they could do what they wanted to do. At the end of the project ended in November 1975. As you know, there were major political changes in Spain. So I don't know if it was because of that political context that it stopped, that it ended, or the other way around. But I think being totally unaware of the political context was a bliss to them, because, for example, they talked about the local people as the natives. They dubbed them the natives. It was kind of weird, right? To say the least. They talked about underdevelopment, and they brought an ecologist, Kenneth Mellonby, UK's first ecologist. He specialized in Kenya and Sub-Saharan Africa. And so they specialized in those areas because the climate is similar. So they were totally unaware of the context. It took them a long time to become aware of it. In some contexts, you can see they really didn't understand it. Thank you. Interesting.
Tenemos otra pregunta por aquí.
I just had a brief comment. You can give him a microphone. This also ties what you just said, because I'm wondering whether there are comparable cases So you spoke about this Norwegian businessman that had these big plantations of bananas. What comes to my mind is the similar situation in the similar historical period in Hawaii. In Hawaii, where there were plantations by Chiquita, also the same kind of fruit, same type of islands, same type of, let's say, environment that is very similar to the Canary Islands because they were growing the same crops, basically. So it has to be the same climate. And there was, is there this a kind of comparative value and in that maybe that kind of similarities that these potential locations share? And secondly, did you find any evidence of, this model being actually used in US? Because you said they use ideas from US, especially around California. It also shares similar kind of climate. And maybe this businessman also in other plantations, maybe he tried to do something similar elsewhere. I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. So yeah, it shares a lot. So the framework of extractivist policies, it's common to many of these regions, especially with bananas. I think banana is a symbol of extraction in a way. So having said that, I think the big difference with this, because basically the ones doing the innovation, or similar proposals that we saw in California, it was mostly hippies in the desert. So it was basically people not integrated with other contexts doing their fantasies, no? It's the time of Burning Man. It's the time of all of these things emerging. But I think what it's relevant from having a Norwegian client is that he had very deep ecological, Nordic ecologic values of.
So are we saying that we in Southern Europe like that?
No. I think that
The difference. But there is a difference in these green values. But let us take the question. We can continue this in the bus.
Okay.
Pues muchísimas gracias porque
Thank you very much. We are very familiar with Foster in Valencia. There is this question of why the project stopped when democracy emerged. I don't know if you could do this, but I think maybe you could work on the connections with the local public government at the time. In my experience, what happened in Valencia in the 70s is that some people had ideas that were absolutely against those innovations, the organic architecture, and they did atrocities in terms of construction with the blessing of the public administration, who turned a blind eye. So when the political change came during the transition to democracy, a movement arose in order to fight against corruption. Corruption was very well present in terms of obtaining licenses, permits, and so on and so forth. So I suspect that maybe there has been a change. There was a change in the local public administration in terms of permits, and maybe that change was responsible for the reason that the project didn't translate into reality. Yes, this regulation was passed in 67. Up until then, you could go to the local administration, probably with different assets to have your plan be passed. And right now it blows your mind, but this happened back in the day.
you could have plans approved just without any logical reason. Sorry, we're talking about the change that happened in 76, 77. That's when the change happened. I think these new regulations make this project less feasible because I have the feeling that the only way in which such a radical project can be implemented was because of a lack of regulations. I wouldn't know whether currently a project that involves so many authorities, I think a master plan for a whole island would be impossible. A master plan that involved so many different aspects. I think nowadays it would be not feasible. It wouldn't be feasible. 15, 20 years ago, I was working in the Belgian consulate in Valencia, and we had a case of a fellow countryman who had a house built in the 70s, and this house was built in a place where, in theory, nothing could be built. So the local public administration turned a blind eye. So this fellow countryman came crying to the consulate because his house was to be demolished a few decades after it was built.
No sé si hay alguna otra pregunta.
Are there any more questions? We have 3 minutes left. I have the feeling that the heat is draining us. We don't have that much energy. So, Anna, how about if you do some closing remarks? Maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, I always have something to say, but I'm going to use all this 3 minutes and 24 seconds to say thank you all today. Thank you, Gabriel, for this beautiful presentation. I think we all learned a lot. He is able and willing. He wants to share the presentation if you want to look at the details. Thank you very much for your patience. And I think we can wrap up maybe with one sentence saying that in relation to his presentation, that Europe indeed is a work in progress. So there are some ideas that still need to be tested. Thank you so much, Gabriel, and word to you.
So I just have to say also thank you to you. Thank you for your cooperation, also for your patience, especially with the weather today, because it was a little bit hot, but hope you enjoy it. And those who are coming tomorrow and who has to present tomorrow already have an idea on how to do that. Also, thank you very much for controlling the schedule, because we just finished on time, but also especially for bringing also this topic to the arena, because I think it's important, especially nowadays when all the Green Deal is being under discussion, and also many people doubting about the efficiency of this when it's something so needed. At least it's something we really think is needed, and we have to fight for that. So I think it was a very important topic. All the topics were very important. So thank you very much to all of you, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and see you for dinner. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.